Don, good evening. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast tonight. It's an honor to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
Yeah, I certainly been looking forward to this conversation. And also, I just think congratulations are in order. You just posted on Instagram that your son has just been commissioned into my beloved Marine Corps. So, how you feeling about that? That's got to be pretty exciting.
It is. I mean, he made poor career decisions, and so he was a Marine instead of the Army, like me. But no, in all seriousness, he is the fourth generation of our family to serve. His great grandfather, my grandfather, served in the Army during World War II, and his grandfather on the other side was a Marine during World War II, and then my dad was drafted in Vietnam. And then I, like you, was a war on terror guy. And so it was neat to see. It was neat. The Marine Corps, and all their infinite wisdom, would not let me commission him because I guess their regulations said you have to either have been retired or still on active duty or the reserves. And so what he wanted to do was a private ceremony the day before. He was in Texas A&M and in the Corps Cadets. And so Friday, we did a private ceremony there at a spot on campus where they earn his outfit. His company earns their brass. And so all of his company from the Corps Cadets came, and one of his buddies that's enlisted in the National Guard did his first salute. And so it was a really special time for sure.
That's amazing, and a great gain for the Corps. I certainly will say there. That always warms my heart, when you actually see just like that there's still a lot of great men and women out there that are still willing to step up and serve, because I'm sure right now for the last couple of years, I keep hearing all these things about low recruitment numbers and so on and so forth, but just to still see that there are those who are willing to step up. But of course, like, how are you feeling about that? Because I'm even though you say you come from, several generations of military service, I'm sure there always is a little bit of that uncertainty, just as a parent that, your son or daughter, you don't really know what the future holds. I mean, we may be in some relative stability right now, all things considered, but, that can change at the drop of a hat, as if history has told us anything.
Yeah, it certainly is a different feeling as a parent. So incredible amount of pride. But when we did the private ceremony, I asked four people to talk ahead of his commissioning. And so one was a guy who I served with briefly in Germany, who was from Texas A&M, graduated from the Corps Cadets, and was a tanker and served as a company or a troop commander in Iraq. And then I had a friend of the family who was the Austin chapter lead for the Travis Manion Foundation, and she helped Will do his Eagle Scout project and was hugely influential in his life. And she is a double Gold Star sister, so she lost a brother in Afghanistan and a brother in Iraq. And then I had two other guys who are two of my closest friends and would work together for a long time as well, who were both Rangers in the Ranger Regiment during the initial invasion in Afghanistan. And the reason why I asked them to do that is I think it's when you're a young platoon leader in the Marines, a platoon commander, and you're 22 or 23 years old, you don't understand what American fathers and mothers have entrusted to you in the form of their sons and daughters to lead. And you don't really understand that until you're a parent and it's your son or daughter that you're entrusting to a 22-year-old kid to lead. And so I asked them to talk a little bit about, each one a little bit different, about what it means to serve, about what it means to lead, about what it means to follow, and kind of to give that oath of office he was about to take a little bit more weight and a little bit more context. And so, like I said, incredibly proud, but also you kind of look on the horizon and see some potential storm clouds gathering, and as a father, as a parent of someone who's serving, that's a hard thing to balance.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of your own military service, if we can go back in time a little bit here, obviously you mentioned that again, your grandfather, your father, both served. So I'm sure they've had quite a bit of influence in you making that decision. So, can we talk a little bit about what, was it that ultimately led you into the Army, again, as opposed to, let's say, a different branch like the Marine Corps, perhaps. or anywhere else for that matter. So yeah, can you kind of just take us back here a little bit and just tell us how you got started down that path?
Yeah, it's funny. I joined the military, I think, much to my dad's chagrin, because I like to say that I was the first member of our family to serve voluntarily. They were both drafted, one in World War II and one in Vietnam. And so I grew up, I was a kid of the 80s. When I grew up, the Cold War was not an abstract thing. It was very much something that was on the headlines every day. You know, there were movies like Red Dawn that fictionalized how the Cold War might play out if it didn't end well, and those were the formative things of my upbringing. Like I remember President Reagan when he authorized the strike into Libya. You know, I remember the his unequivocal answer when somebody asked him, what does it mean, you know, in our conflict with the Soviet Union? And he said, we win and they lose. And it was a very binary thing. And I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to serve. And so from high school, about my junior year of high school, I decided all of the school thing was not for me anymore. I didn't really want to do it. And there just so happened to be an Army recruiter who was on campus that day, and he gave me this brochure, and it had pictures of guys jumping out of helicopters and, you know, crawling around in the dirt, and it looked like they were having the time of their life. And so I came home and showed it to my dad, and I was only 17, and he's like, listen, I am not signing any paperwork for you, any of this delayed entry thing. He's like, if you want to enlist when you're 18 after you graduate, I'll drive you down to the office myself. But right now you got to finish high school. And so as I did that, I started hearing more about West Point and ROTC and things of that nature. And so I actually applied to West Point in the Air Force Academy. My grades weren't good enough to get in. I got a congressional nomination, but wasn't accepted. But I did get an Army scholarship. And so I knew that I wanted to fly, and I thought about still going Air Force ROTC potentially. But when I looked at the Air Force, I thought, man, it would be amazing to fly planes. But if you can't fly a plane, if I don't get a pilot slot, what do the rest of those people even do? Like I didn't, I didn't know at the time. And I looked at the Army and like, man, if I can't fly, they let you drive tanks around and blow stuff up. Like that seems like something for me. And so chose the Army, and like I said, had an Army ROTC scholarship to school, and then was fortunate enough to do well enough to get selected for aviation, and then do well enough to get selected for Apache gunship. So it was a great gig. I got to fly Apaches for 10 years, and including doing a tour duty in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2006 as an air cavalry troop commander. So it was a great thing. I only served 10 years. Some of my friends did longer, and a couple of, actually two of the guys I knew in ROTC are now generals and are still serving. And so I think there's something about service to our nation that is good for the person, no matter how long they choose to do it, because there are a lot of words people use in corporate America, like servant leadership or, you know, team before self or things like that. And I don't mean to say they don't know what those words mean, but I think the military teaches you that in a completely different context. You know, in the Army, it was drilled into your head very early as a young lieutenant that your job was to take care of soldiers. And they modeled that for you. So for instance, you know, we were aviation. So when we went to the field, they actually cooked meals for us. And so, but as an officer, you always ate last, and you would do that, number one, on the off chance that they ran out of food, that your guys and girls, your enlisted guys and girls would get some. Now in aviation units, they never run out of food. But the other part is that you would stand there and watch as your soldiers went through the chow line, right? Because that's one of your chances as a leader to check in on your soldiers, to be able to take care of them. You know, another great tradition that I still miss is that on holidays like Thanksgiving or Christmas Day or something, you would get dressed up in your dress blues, and you would go to the dining facility and you would serve the meal to your soldiers, right? And the reason why you do that is because at some point in time in combat, you may be, as a leader, in the position where you're going to ask them to do a very, very hard thing, right, and a thing that might result in their death potentially. And they're going to do it for you in theory because you outrank them and because you say so. But the real reason they're going to do it is because you've built that bond as a leader and they know that you have taken care of them and that you're still going to do your best as a leader to take care of them. And that's why men follow leaders, because they believe that that leader is actually going to take care of them to the detriment of their self if necessary. And I think that you can certainly get that in corporate America or other places, but I think the military teaches that in a way that it just embeds into the fiber of your being.
Well, there's a lot of sacrifice that you see amongst military leaders, like you said, eating last when they're probably just as hungry as the rest of their troops, or maybe, staying up just a little bit later to stand watch, or being the first on the battlefield, the last one to step off. And of course, for a lot of them, like you said, you got like these early 20s lieutenants, like fresh out of the academy and everything. And, they've had to grow up so fast already because they really had no other choice. It's what's expected of them. And it's what, not only, like you said, the parents of those that serve under them are counting on them, but of course, their men just as well are counting on them.
Yeah.
And a lot of that transfers so well into the civilian world, almost to the point where it surprises like a lot of people. I'm an archaeological crew leader right now, and it surprises some of the archaeologists that are a part of my crew, where I always make sure that they're not the last ones to leave the field. I am.
Right.
Like if I finish my shovel tests sooner, I'm going back to each and every one of them to make sure that they're good. And if they need help finishing up theirs, I'm going to help finish up theirs.
Yep.
Where I think a lot of people have the tendency to just, as soon as they're done, just go retreat back to comfort, go get inside the trucks and turn on the AC because it's hot out, or, bust open the food, whatever it may be. But I definitely think there's a lot of like transferable skills that, again, when you transfer those to the civilian sector, it surprises a lot of people, because like you said, there are a lot of civilian leaders that do embody those types of characteristics, but I would almost dare say it's kind of few and far between, though, I'd say.
Yeah, I think another aspect of the military is that when you're a young platoon leader, platoon commander, and certainly the same thing if you're a young NCO, there's an expectation. In fact, you're taught that as a young platoon leader, that you're responsible for everything that platoon does or fails to do. Like all of that you own. And I think a lot of the frustration right now that the American people feel towards different aspects of our government is you see senior leaders like the director of the Secret Service, for instance, who finally resigned after her testimony, who said, "Okay, it's my fault that this happened," but there were no. She accepted it, but there weren't the repercussions that you would expect for having failed, whether it was her personal failure or not. If you take that and put that template on a military unit, if you as a young platoon leader had failed in that degree, you'd be relieved like instantly that day, whether it was your fault or not that fault. You are responsible for everything the men and women under your command do or don't do. And so it breeds a completely different sense of accountability, of a focus on mission, of what it means to serve and to lead, that you don't frankly find a whole lot, unfortunately, outside of the military.
Yeah, there definitely is, not a whole lot of accountability that I think we've seen over a lot of the decisions, and also a lot of the failures of the last couple of years. Now, seldomly do I ever really let myself get too wrapped up in social media, but I will admit, Don, earlier this week, I kind of did. And I saw some of the video footage, and you've probably seen it by now too, of the Taliban parading through Afghanistan with all of the equipment that was left behind for them during the botched Afghanistan withdrawal, which we still haven't seen hardly any accountability, if at all, for that. It seems like, it was one of those things where it happened and it's like, oh, let's just talk about COVID now. Let's get back to talking about COVID. So yeah, that has to be a frustrating thing. And, for veterans, and perhaps I'll even dare say, active military service members alike.
Yeah. The fourth book in my Matt Drake series was called Forgotten War. And I wrote it during the fall of Afghanistan, because it was as it was happening, you couldn't believe that this was actually unfolding before your eyes. And so I'm getting text messages, and I'm the anomaly. I only did one tour duty in Afghanistan. Most of the people I served with or who have continued to serve have done multiple tours across both Afghanistan and Iraq. And I kept getting these text messages or calls or emails from veteran friends with, some variation of this question of, was it even worth it? Was the 20 years of blood and sacrifice and treasure and the time spent away from family and the birthdays missed and the anniversaries missed, was any of it worth it? And I didn't know how to answer that. And so I had to try and figure it out by writing that book. But it was, when folks were asking me what I thought, and I certainly don't want to imply that I speak for all veterans or frankly any veteran, but myself.
Sure. Yeah.
But my oldest son that we were just talking about, he's kind of a 9/11 baby. So he was born shortly after September 11th. And so as a father, to think, that my son might have to go back to Afghanistan a generation later and continue to fight that war, I think many of us were all in favor of figuring out a way to, with honor and dignity and by keeping a stabilizing force in Afghanistan, to withdraw from that. Like there was no reason in my mind why 20 something years later, my son should now have to go face the same enemy that we faced 20 years prior. But on the other hand, the way that it was done and the way that we withdrew from Afghanistan, it just put into question everything else. I was getting, like I said, messages from friends saying, what about Iraq? Did that matter? If Afghanistan doesn't matter, does any of these things that we've done matter? And I think that is the amazing thing about the war on terror and Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi freedom is that everybody knows that it was fought by an all-volunteer army, but I think or military rather, but what most people don't realize is it's something like only 0.25% of Americans served during that time. And the majority of those who served in both theaters of war. And so what that means is for 20 years, a tiny fraction of the American population raised their right hand over and over again and voluntarily bore their nation's combat duties. And I think twofold. One, that means the majority of Americans don't know anybody who served in Iraq or Afghanistan, don't know them well. And two, I think that when Americans stopped coming home in body bags every week or every day, which is good, what it allowed our leaders to do is take their eye off the ball, right? Because nobody is holding them accountable in the same way they would if it was your kid and my kid and everybody else's kid who was in Afghanistan or Iraq. That's one of the very unique things about Israel, and we see it playing out in the Gaza war, is everybody's son or daughter or brother or sister is serving that, because everybody in Israel has a mandatory 2-year service, and many of them continue to serve in the reserves afterwards. And so it's much more of a national consensus or a national decision of when we go to war or not, and the population has a vested interest in making sure those who are politically making the decisions are held accountable for those decisions. And I think for 20 years, we didn't have that. And we drifted along, in kind of an entropy because of that. And so, yeah, I mean, seeing that parade again, it definitely brought up a lot of bad thoughts and memories of that time. And you still shake your head. You almost hope that it was some kind of AI thing, that it wasn't real. And
right.
It's real. It's real.
Yeah. And then it also, like I said, does make me think a little bit about the future, because, I mean, the world watched that too. And the world is watching us. Our enemies, those that wish to do us harm, are watching that. And, to see that the Taliban was able to undo 20 years worth of work in just like a week. And it just, I'm sure that probably just tells like the rest of the world, it's like, well, clearly America is like backed up against the ropes right now, and can they fight their way out of it? And so it just, I feel like we just kind of look weaker on the world stage as a result of that botched Afghanistan withdrawal. And then, of course, we saw so many other things unfold over the past few years since then, just as well too. It's just, I think that's one thing that does kind of sort of scare me a little bit about the future, Don, is that are people afraid of America, like, anymore? And then, because I think it was just a few decades ago, it's just no one wanted to mess with us. It's like if you mess with like an American abroad or anything like that, it was almost like Roman type sort of
Yeah.
retaliation. But I'm not sure if that's something people are really worried about across the world anymore.
Yeah, and that's the kind of the counterintuitive nature of how deterrence actually works. And so people, all the time misunderstand what the laws of war are, and they talk about proportionality of response. So the way that you keep an adversary from pressing their gain is that you take away from them the ability to do the battlefield calculus that says, if I do this, they're going to respond with that. So for instance, they know, if the Iranians right now say, okay, if I, through one of my proxies, attack U.S. soldiers in Iraq again, or in Syria, or in Jordan, where 3 of them were killed, then I know the United States response is going to be what? And if they know that and they can take that into their calculus, then they say, okay, it's worth it. I'm worth living, whatever that response is. I'm worth them firing a couple missiles at me. And the way that you get around that is through disproportionate response and unexpected response. That it's one of my favorite lines from the movie The Untouchables. You send one of us to the hospital, we send one of yours to the morgue. And that's the way you establish deterrence, is that you take away from the adversary the ability to do battlefield calculus. That it would, going back to President Reagan again, and he wasn't perfect and had some things go wrong. But when the Iranians were hassling shipping and stuff and back in, I think it was 86 or 87 or something, he did Operating Praying Mantis, where they sunk almost the majority of the Iranian Navy in 24 hours time. And that disproportional response and unexpected response firmly established deterrence in the Iranians' mind, because we don't have any way to plan now. We aren't able to say, if we do X, he's going to do Y. And so it's kind of the opposite from the, hey, can we just sit down at a table and negotiate and come to an understanding? And that's great, but negotiations only work if you're negotiating from a place of strength and your adversary knows that you're willing to use that strength. And I think absent those things, the world becomes a much more dangerous place.
Well, and of course, that's just kind of the way the world has always worked. I mean, just look on history. I mean,
yeah,
the mightiest of empires, like that's how they were able to expand their reach so far. It's just because they've always made it a point to say that, yeah, we're not ones to be trifled with in any sort of way. And good or bad, but people can have their own, way of looking at it, I suppose. But again, the world, it's always just been like that. That's just the way the world works. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, strength deters aggression, and strength and the willingness to use that strength. You have to have both. If you just have strength, but you're not willing to use it, you're not going to deter your adversary.
Absolutely. All right. So you said that much of this was kind of woven into your first book series featuring your protagonist, Matt Drake. So when did that kind of sort of fall in the timeline of your story?
Yeah. So I've always been, I think people who write fiction successfully are storytellers at heart. And so, like I said, I was a kid of the 80s, and they had some amazing TV that time, shows like The A-Team and Knight Rider and Airwolf. And I remember, even as a kid, watching some of those and then thinking afterwards, man, wouldn't it have been cool if this would have happened instead? And so, I would mow the grass and think about stories. And so I started writing pretty early. When I was in high school, I had a great English teacher who still comes to my book signings now when I'm back home in Cincinnati, which is amazing. And she took me aside once when we had an assignment to write a scene or something like that. And she said, I think you could actually do this. You could be a writer. And her encouragement was pretty profound, but I wasn't ready to bank the farm on it. So when I went to college, I majored in electrical engineering, which all good writers do. And so even in college, though, one of the things I would do in my spare time is, I'd have story ideas. And I think I started working on my first book in high school, my first attempt at a book, I should say. In college, I worked on a book too. While I was in the military, I used to get up at 4:30 in the morning before PT and write, and then go in to do PT physical training at 6:30. And so I wrote my first completed book while I was in the military, and that didn't sell. And so then I wrote another book while I was in Afghanistan, when we'd come back from missions and everybody else would play Xbox or read books or do whatever. I would work on my second book, and that didn't sell. And then I wrote my third book, and that didn't sell. And so finally, my fourth book in the series, Without Sanction, did sell, and it sold in a 2-book deal, and that allowed me to continue. But I wrote over 17 years, 3 books that never sold, and countless other books that were starts and stuff. And I think, with anything else in life, you have to be talented to be able to do the thing that you want to do, but it's also a whole lot about showing up every day and working at the thing and working at the thing. I'm not a huge sports fan, but for whatever reason, Kobe Bryant started popping up into my reels. And when you listen to him, and certainly Kobe Bryant has a talent that very few people have, but part of in hand with that was his famous work ethic, right? Where he figured out if he got up at something at like 4 a.m, he could get 3 workouts in a day when everybody else was only getting 2 in a day. And I think with people who are very successful, those two things go together. And frankly, a lot of times a work ethic can overcome a lack of talent in things, right? Like there are plenty of folks in writing, you see it a lot. There's kind of the saying that a lot of folks can write 1 book, but not very many people can write 2. And what that means is you have your entire life to write your first book. But once you sell it and your publisher comes back and says, I need another book next year, in a year later, you got a year to write that book, that's completely different. And a lot of people kind of stumble at that, because now you've taken something that you could do on your own time, whatever, and you have to find a way to put that rigor in and say, can I produce every day? And can I write every day? And am I willing to come back to it day after day after day?
Well, and then also going along with your story too is just being able to deal with the failures and learn from the failures too. Because like you mentioned, you wrote 3 books that didn't sell. And, I'm sure there was probably moments, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, that maybe you felt really defeated and you probably weren't sure, should you try to put out the next one or the one after that for that matter. Yeah. But then of course, now here we go, 4th time's the charm, and that one sold, and now you got the deal coming from there. I've had moments like that with this podcast too, where I feel like I put out a really good episode early on when I started this thing, but then hardly anyone listened to it. Like my download numbers were just not good at all. But now it's like, I'm talking with men like you, like Jack Carr, Brad Thor, all these like incredible people that I get to talk to because I just kept going. You just got to stay consistent
showing
with
up.
it. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So you had your Matt Drake series, and you also did a little bit with one of Tom Clancy's characters, Jack Ryan Jr. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I've written, my book that comes out on September 3rd is called Capture or Kill, and that's the 9th book I've written. So I did 4 of my Matt Drake books, and I did 4 in the Tom Clancy universe as well. And I was really, really fortunate that I had the same editor for both. And so again, kind of there's that old saying that, opportunity looks a lot like work or something to that extent. And that after my second book came out, my editor came back and he said, hey, the guy, and he's a great writer, Mike Madden, that was writing the series before me, isn't going to write it anymore. He's like, do you want to write the Clancy one? And at first I was going to tell him no, because it wasn't at a point where I was making enough money off books that I could afford to do it full time, and I had a day job and everything. And then I talked to my wife about it, and I said, hey, my editor asked me if I wanted to write the Clancy books, and I'm going to tell him no. And she's like, no, you're not. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she's like, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. You have to say yes. And so we kind of figured it out as a family of what that would look like. And eventually it allowed me, I was still kind of on the point where I'm writing books, but I can't pay all the bills by writing them, and I'm trying to do a day job. And so my editor called me again, and he said, "Hey, they're going to start doing, instead of the Clancy universe, what they would do is there'd be a book that would come out in like wintertime, like December or January. That was Jack Ryan Sr. and Mark Cameron was writing those books. And then I would write in the same universe with some of the same characters, and my book would come out 6 months later in June. And so there were 2 books a year that came out. And so my editor called me up and he said, "Hey, they're going to start doing 3 a year, and it's going to alternate between like you and Mark on who has the 2 books that come out that year." And he's like, "I know there's no way you would want to write that extra book, so I'm just telling you that I'm going to go get a writer to do it." And I'm like, "No, I'll write it." And he's like, "Really?" And I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely. I'll write one more." And so that allowed me to go full time. But for a period of about 2 years, that meant I had to write now a book every 5 months. And so I would alternate between one of my Matt Drake books and a Clancy book, and a Matt Drake book and a Clancy book. And it was one of the hardest 2 year stretches of my life, because you're turning things around so quickly and you don't want the quality to fall off. But it absolutely gave me the opportunity now to write for Vince Flynn. And each one of those things, so Mark Graney, that writes the Gray Man series and a bunch of other stuff, has been a huge mentor to me. And very early on, he told me, in writing, the work will be there before the money will be. And what he meant was, like, you'll have the opportunity to do it. It won't pay enough for you to do it full time. And you'll have to decide, am I going to bet on myself and go in with the hope that I'll write better and better books and get paid more and more and can do it full time. And so, that was my story by saying yes to the Clancy one, by writing the extra books. That absolutely gave me the opportunity to write the Vince Flynn books, which was a huge game changer for me. And so, I wouldn't have been able to do what I'm doing now without taking that risk. And part of it was taking a risk, and then part of it was being willing to work really, really hard. And I think that's just, whether it's writing, whether it's launching your own small business, whether it's any of those things, most of the folks who are successful figure out a way to do that.
And so now you're getting ready to carry on the Mitch Rapp series. Yeah. And so how are you feeling about that? Because, Vince Flynn created such a beloved character. Yeah. He wrote 13 books, and then Kyle Mills wrote 8 or 9. One of the two. I know that much. So I think it kind of goes without saying, big shoes to fill, taking over this series. So how you feeling about carrying that on?
Yeah, big shoes to fill on a couple of different levels. And so Vince Flynn is my all-time favorite writer. He is the first. So Brad Thor and Vince Flynn were peers. I think Brad came along just a little bit later. Vince was the first kind of post 9/11 writer who had that idea of, I'm going to write this character who hunts our nation's enemies on their own turf and shoots terrorists in the face. Like, that's what he's going to do. And so all of us who write in this genre now take aspects of what Vince did, and we use it in our own books. Like, many of the protagonists you see now, I think, trace their lineage back to Mitch Rapp, because Vince was a groundbreaker. In fact, when either my second or third book didn't sell, I took my favorite Vince Flynn book, which was Protect and Defend, and I used note cards to write out every single chapter, and I color coded it by character. And we lived in a little house then, and I didn't have an office, and so I taped it to my bedroom wall, which my wife just loved. And so for me, it was kind of like the difference between looking at a building and looking at the blueprints of the building. So I could see kind of how Vince did what he did. How many chapters would he go before he brought Mitch Rapp back in? How many would he go before there was another gunfight or fist fight or something? And so he was a huge, even though I wasn't ever lucky enough to meet him, as a fan and as a writer, he played a huge, huge role in my life. And so then to get the opportunity to write in his universe was very humbling. And also, when I took over the Clancy gig, I knew that I was standing on the shoulders of giants. Like, Mark Graney was one of the first, or was the first writer after Clancy died, to continue that tradition. And Mark's a fantastic writer. Mike Madden is fantastic. Mark Cameron is fantastic. But there had been enough writers in the Tom Clancy universe that it wasn't really a big deal to the fans when I came in, because they had established enough trust that, no matter who they bring in, the editor, Tom Colgan, does a fantastic job of picking the right writer. And so the fans were fine. When Vince passed away, he was really young. He was only 47 when he died of prostate cancer. For a while, nobody even knew whether the series was going to continue. And then Kyle Mills, who was a peer of Vince, who's a fantastic writer in his own right, already a New York Times bestselling author, agreed to come in and take over the series. And he didn't just tread water with it. Like, he expanded the series. He took it in new directions. And so the fans were comfortable with him after, I think it was 9 books in 10 years, that he could do it. And so when they announced that I was taking over, David Brown, we were talking about before, my publicist and Kyle's publicist and Brad Thor's publicist, he texted me and he's like, "You're trending on Twitter right now." And what was trending, though, was all of the fans of this beloved series saying, "Welcome aboard, but don't screw this up, because this is my favorite series ever."
Yeah,
and
no pressure.
They had a right to say that. Yeah. And so they absolutely had a right to say that. And so for me, going back to me being a kid of the 80s again, one of my favorite 80s movies was Top Gun. And so I was very, very nervous when Top Gun Maverick came out, because I thought, is this going to ruin the original movie? Is it going to take something that I've loved, and for them trying to tell a second story with it, just tear it apart? And I thought they did such a fantastic job with that movie.
It was great.
And they were respectful to the fans. They did little nods to everything about the first Top Gun, that everybody, just like the opening scene was, the same with the darkness on the Top Gun anthem and the carrier and everything. But they also expanded that, and they took the movie in new directions and brought in new characters. And so that's really what I wanted to do, was to say, how do I come in and write kind of a love letter to the fans, but then take the book in a different direction. And so when I was looking at the series and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, I was reading all of Vince's books over and over again. And not because Kyle isn't fantastic, he is, but I wanted to go back to the source of the series and just immerse myself in how Vince, I can't write like he did, but I want to be able to tell the same kind of stories that he told. And so to immerse myself into his characters. And so when I was doing that, when Vince started writing, so his first book ever was Term Limits, but the first book that Mitch Rapp showed up in was Transfer of Power. And every year that Vince wrote another book, he kind of set the book in that year, if that makes sense. So if the book came out in 2005, he would talk about 2005 stuff in there. And so as I was looking at it, Vince wrote, sequentially like this year after year until Pursuit of Honor. And then he took a break from the current day and went back in time and wrote 2 prequels. And so he wrote American Assassin and then Kill Shot. And then he jumped forward in time, but he didn't pick up at the exact year he left off. He picked up on the year it was then. And so then he wrote The Last Man, which was the final book in his series. So there was really just this couple year gap in between when Pursuit of Honor was and The Last Man. And I thought, that's really interesting. Like, he left this spot where nobody knows what Mitch Rapp was doing. And so I started doing the math and trying to figure out what years that covered. And there was one year in particular that stood out to me, and it was 2011. And I'm like, something happened in 2011.
Yep.
That was,
I know what you're thinking. Mm-hmm.
That was when we decided to go after bin Laden and kill him in Abbottabad.
Yep.
And so Capture or Kill answers the question that Vince Flynn fans have been asking for about the last 13 years, which is, what did Mitch Rapp have to do with the Osama bin Laden raid? And so it was a ton of fun to research and write. And I got to, because I went back in time, bring some characters back that has since passed on in the series. And so it really is kind of my version of Top Gun Maverick. Like, this is my love letter to the fans, and you get to see this iconic operation going on in the background and see what Mitch Rapp had to do with it.
That sounds incredible. And actually, yeah, I didn't even think about that. But yeah, because Vince Flynn did age Mitch Rapp in real time.
Yeah.
And then, when Kyle took over, he kind of sort of stopped aging Mitch Rapp.
Yeah.
So there definitely was that 2-year period when he wrote American Assassin and Kill Shot. So,
yeah.
I like that idea, sir. That sounds great.
I hope so. I hope a lot of people like it, but it was really fun to do. And I started to look, when I had the idea, I was like, I wonder if Vince ever talked about it. And so if you go to his website, he still has a section where it's fans wrote in questions to Vince, and he would answer some of them and post them on his website. And so I found one where somebody asked him, point blank, what was Mitch Rapp doing during the bin Laden raid? And he answered something to the effect of, the Navy SEALs certainly fast rope in and shot bin Laden, but there were a lot of intelligence agencies that were setting the stage for that operation, right? That were doing the intelligence preparation of the battlefield, that were setting the conditions for it. And he said something to the effect of, I'd imagine that's what Mitch Rapp was doing. And I was like, right there, that's where I've got. And so that kind of led me down the trail of what else was going on at that time. One of the interesting things as you and I sit here and talk about it is that we know that it was successful. And so we're kind of removed from the fact of what was going on in the Situation Room as they were making that decision, right? It's easy for us to say, well, of course it worked because it worked, right? But President Biden is on record for famously saying that he told President Obama, don't do it. Like, I don't think you should do it, because if that raid had gone sideways, potentially we could have had a shooting war in Pakistan. What if the Pakistani Air Force would have seen our helicopters coming? There could have been that relationship with Pakistan that was so key to trying to contain Afghanistan and the Taliban, and what would have happened if that would have all blown up. And so I think it allowed me to kind of explore some of that, and then also doing the research. Like, it's fascinating, not just how they figured out where bin Laden was, but the different methods they used to try and figure out who's in that compound and is it the right one and who's the guy. And so it was really fun. I put an author's note in the book because there's some things I played with from a timeline perspective to make Mitch's story more interesting. But a lot of the details in there were either based on things that actually happened or were things that actually happened. So it was really fun to do.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it. And as this episode goes live, the book will just be coming out as well. So how can our listeners and our viewers, how can they find it? How can they connect with you? And so where are you out there in the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can do both of those things. So you can buy the book anywhere books are sold, but you can also go to my website. That's donbentleybooks.com, just Bentley. And there's a link to the book there, links to interviews about it. You can sign up for my newsletter to hear about everything I'm working on. And I'm also on Instagram and X and Facebook, and my handle's the same for all three. So it's easy to remember. It's just at Bentley Don B. So BentleyDonB. And I always love to hear from fans and readers, even if you think it sucks. So still, I want to hear that too. Not really, but I'll hear it if you send me an email too.
Well, even if it's a bad review, at least they still read the book.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
exactly.
I guess, little silver lining there, I suppose. All right. Well, and I'll also get all those linked up in the show notes for this episode, or if we have viewers watching us talk on YouTube, they can find it in the description below. So it'll be all there for them to go and click away and find everything. All right. So, Don, as we start winding down here, I just have a few final standard questions that I like to ask all my guests towards the end of the show. And the first of those is I like to ask my guests to issue a challenge to our listeners because, we shared some we heard some stories from you today. We also got some insights from you as well. But as I say, stories, insights, ideas, inspiration can only take our listeners and viewers so far. They actually have to go and follow up what they hear today with action to go out and do amazing things in life. So, with that, what challenge would you issue to our listeners today for them to go out there and start living a more adventurous life?
Yeah, I think success doesn't happen accidentally, it happens intentionally. And so whether it's that you want to write a book, then set your alarm 30 minutes earlier and start writing your book. If you want to be more physically fit, actually plan out your workout and do it. If you want to have a better relationship with your kids, block off the time to do that. I think I can't, and again, part of that's from the military and the what's drilled into you about how to be disciplined and how to plan. But if you want to do those things, if you want to do anything great, you're not going to stumble into it. You have to plan to be able to do it and then actually block that out on your schedule and go do it.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. All right. So, what I have for you next is my final three. Again, these are three, I like to think that they're fun questions that I ask all my guests at the end of the show. And the first of these three questions is, what is your favorite place that you've been to so far?
So we lived in three different foreign countries and got to travel all over Europe. And we're very, very fortunate to go to some pretty amazing places. But this summer, my son was doing a study abroad in Barcelona, Spain. And so we went over as a family. And either Barcelona or Tel Aviv are kind of neck and neck for my two favorite cities in the world now. Barcelona, the people are friendly. The food is fantastic. Most everybody speaks English. The beaches and stuff there are just amazing. Barcelona is a pretty incredible place.
All right, outstanding. And I haven't been to Barcelona yet myself. I have been to Tel Aviv, and I did like it there.
Yeah.
A lot of sushi restaurants. That's one thing I have noticed. There's so many sushi restaurants everywhere. So, all right. And the next question that I have in this final three, what is one thing on your bucket list that you have yet to do?
I haven't jumped out of an airplane yet. I turned 50 this year, and my wife, she's like, come on, we're going to do it. Come on. And then I chickened out and didn't do it. So she turns 50 next year. Maybe we'll both jump out of an airplane then.
All right. Well, I'm sure there's quite a difference between flying them and jumping out of the aircraft. So, okay. Yeah, I see that. Well, as someone who skydived myself, I'll tell you this, as soon as you jump out of the plane, you're fine. I mean, you'll feel the butterflies getting up to altitude, but if you just get yourself out of the plane, you're good from there. So adrenaline and fun just takes over. So
nice.
All right. And the last of these three questions, and this is a two-parter. What is your favorite animal, and have you seen this animal in the wild?
I think my favorite one now might be the honey badger because a honey badger don't care and they just go on life and they are you can be my friends that are Army Rangers say that there are two types of Rangers. There are strong Rangers and smart Rangers, and I think honey badgers maybe are a little bit of both. And no, I have not seen them in the wild.
All right. All in due time, though, I'm sure. All right. Well, Don, that's it. That's all the questions that I have for you this evening. But before we call it a day here, let's just recap one more time where our listeners can go and connect with you, where they can go pick up a copy of Capture or Kill. So, again, websites, social media accounts. What do you got for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is donbentley.books.com. So Bentley, and there are links to Capture or Kill there. You should be able to pick it up everywhere books are sold on September 3rd. And if you're a social media person, you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, X at Bentley Don B. So just at Bentley Don B.
All right. And like I mentioned, I'll have everything linked up in the show notes for this episode or on the description below if we have viewers on YouTube. So it'll be all there for them to go and find everything. All right. Well, Don, I want to thank you very much for taking the time for joining me today. I know things get really busy leading up to the release of a book, and I know you're getting ready to travel for a book tour, but I really appreciate you taking the time for joining me this evening and sharing your stories and insights with myself and the listeners today. This has been great, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Josh.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, sir. Right on.